Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm not checking my messages. This is where my notes are. Sorry. Though it'll be very dangerous if people start texting me in the middle of me talking. I had a challenge this morning. I woke up and I so make sure to have everything set with my contact with the world and also with my intellectual data. And I woke up and not only was my phone dead, but the Mophie that I have as a backup was dead. It didn't go into the socket the way it was supposed to last night. And so I realized, I woke up and I said, I'm electrically challenged today. and it's relevant because my notes for this talk were on there. And so it raised in me the issue of electricity itself. Because we come in a world today where the more we know about science, the more we also understand our deepest spirituality. It used to be that these things were seen in contradiction, but now we start to see that there's a confluence to such a degree, for example, that there are people who are measuring the electricity between trees and groves of trees, and they've discovered that consciousness, even within trees, of relationship and connection. And at the deepest levels, the farthest reaches of the cosmos that we now can see with our mind's eye and understand scientifically, also to the innermost workings of each and every atom in our beings, there is electricity, there is connection, there is interactivity. And it seems to be the fabric of the universe is based on that sense of connection. And I became fascinated with this because from the time that I was little, I grew up in a very, very small minority called the Jewish people. And I grew up very, very, very religious. And so within that Jewish community, I was a tiny minority as well. And so I was in a cocoon of a very small world, and yet the teachers I had a consciousness of all of humanity. So we were in this very spiritually strict universe of observance, many of which I still do to this day, and yet at the same time, my teachers, who were refugees from Germany, were teaching me Kant. You know, Immanuel Kant, a Christian pietist. So I said, why am I doing all these laws? And then I'm connected to Immanuel Kant from 300 years ago. And I worked, and I thought, and yet he's German. And we just lost 9 out of every 10 Jews, in all of Europe after 1,000 years. And I say, what's the connection here? What's the disconnection? And I realized, and I started searching philosophy and psychology and science. And only recently, I think, are we starting to put it all together in a very exciting way. I don't know if you know that there's something in our brains called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons means that every single time, if I come over to you and I greet you and I look into your eyes and I say something very kind to you, or I tell you a story of something sad that happened to me, I'm actually creating neurons in your brain that are exactly like mine. It's called a mirror neuron. And that's the reason why we feel empathy. So that I realized that this is like a trick of nature. This is a connectivity of nature that has actual physical reality. But it also is the basis of spiritual connection across enemy divides, across the lines of hate. So for 40 years, I have been going to the land of people who are my enemies. For 30 years, I've been a peacemaker in the Middle East, and I work together deeply with Arabs and with Arab Christians and with Arab Muslims. And I've been going to Syria for 10 years, and I have thousands of students across Syria. And now they're in their Holocaust. Each one of them comes to me and they'll say, 30 members from my family, 40 members from my family, and it's just like what we went through. And we sit and we cry. And they hold me, and I become a father to them. I was just with a kid a couple of months ago, last time that I was in Jordan, working with my Syrians and my students that I bring from Canada too. Wonderful Anglican minister that came with me, 70 years old. And I held in my arms a little boy with the biggest smile you could possibly imagine. A little Arab Muslim boy. And when I held him, it was like an electrical energy came through me because I could feel the second that he lost half of his body. He didn't have half of his body in the barrel bomb. And when I held him, and he was smiling so much, I was right there when it happened. You know? I don't understand that. But it's real. It got transferred into my brain. That's empathy. That's the power of empathy and love. And what we're discovering from a scientific point of view is that this is something that's very deep and basic to every human being. But the human beings that lose it, they lose it because of other things that happen to depress that, to suppress it, to kill it. But that basically we are endowed with a spiritual reality and a scientific foundation to it that makes us all into lovers of the other, no matter how different that other is. This is the hopeful signs that we're seeing. And indeed, in the last 300 years since Kant, we are statistically more empathic than we've ever been before in human history. There's more rights for people who are very different, people who you don't know, people who you don't particularly like, men and women, children. Steadily, over the last 300 years, we have more laws and more principles and institutions from our higher reason that have protected us and made us live very long lifespans. This is very exciting news. And the media and the news that tells us things are terrible are also hardwired, ingrained from millions of years of us, being afraid the moment there's a twig that breaks in the dark, it might be a lion that will eat us. It's very hardwired that we're worried about the news. It's okay. But there's an imbalance because it gives us the illusion that things are bad and getting worse. Whereas overall, over many lifespans, we know for a fact that there is more compassion on this planet than ever before, across religions, across cultures. And that we're meeting the other as we have never done before in history. There are challenges, however. It's critical that empathy, the danger of empathy, and even empathy has a challenge. Empathy is not quite the same thing in the brain as compassion. Compassion means that you have empathy for people who are very different than your in-group, the people you trust the most. If you have empathy only with your own, that's a prescription for thousands of years of war. And indeed, that's happened. Every single nation fighting for God and country. They had God in common, but they didn't have a different country, and so they killed each other en masse. 20 million World War I. Everybody fighting for God and country, everybody Christian actually. So that empathy is a tricky thing. It needs in the brain to move to the level of compassion, which means empathy for those who are different. And that takes a leap of reason in the higher use of the neocortex that says that even people who are different than me, they feel the same suffering. They have the same hopes. And so I have to make a principle in my mind of what I shouldn't do to them or the other. The same principles. And that's where we start to build the rule of law and reason that concretizes compassion, that makes it into a way of life and a habit of human life. It's not easy to do, but we're doing it more than we've ever done in history. Now, I've thought about this, we've thought about this a lot in our field. One of the biggest challenges we have today is the incredible divide between people who are religious and people who are anti-religious. Because that is one of the great polarities left, where many people who are anti-religious or non-religious feel that the only hope is to get rid of religion. Because religion has been indeed responsible for thousands of wars in history, crusades, pogroms, holocausts, etc. And so that's their answer. And then religious people say, what are you, crazy? Since you've not adopted religion in the 20th century, 100 million dead from very secular things called fascism and communism. So why are you saying that it's religion's fault? And so there's back and forth and tremendous agitation. I come from the academy. I've been in academia for 30 years. People are refugees there from religion. People go there to escape religious intolerance. And so we need to have a peace process between religious and secular people, all of whom have the same mirror neurons. They all have the same capacity for compassion, for love, and for the use of the higher mind to create universal values, to create values we share across divides. The hardest thing I've done in my life has been to go from my small cocoon in every stage, every decade of my life, to push myself beyond my boundaries of fear and concern for my own group, and to leap forward to the enemy, terrifying enemy. It's a glorious journey. It's frightening, but it's a glorious journey. And every time my brain lights up with something called surprise. The neuroscientists love surprise, because surprise is one of the few things that lights up your fMRI in all sectors of your brain. So when you meet somebody that you expect to hate you, and they say, I love you, wow, it changes all of life. When I meet somebody who is from a group that my country says is a terrorist group, and he says, you know, I grew up with Jewish people, I'm a history teacher, I love you, and I love your people, and it totally defies all of my stereotypes, you know, my brain changes, my life changes, my heart changes. That doesn't mean that you don't have to defend yourself according to rationality. We all have to take care of ourselves, protect ourselves from violence and from violent people. But the joy and the discovery of the other, it's the great undiscovered country. It's the great undiscovered face of God in all of human beings. And I think it's the mystical secret of what the great prophets, including Jesus, who was my, I consider a cousin, a distant cousin. He was so in touch with my rabbis, you know, Hillel and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva, all arguing for this magical notion of loving across the divide as a way of discovering God. So have a blessed day. Thank you.